Imagine a lot of people keeping their eyes on what's happening there. And to talk about what a few of these big decisions mean, I spoke earlier to the president of Euro-Pacific Capital, Peter Schiff. He's in Houston, Texas. Now, he told me why Greece has the right intentions in mind with this new plan. Take a look.
Well, it's the right direction. Maybe it's not the right order of magnitude. The problem is the austerity isn't austere enough. And, you know, if the Greek people are protesting, it shouldn't be at the austerity. It should be the profligacy of the Greek government that made the austerity necessary. And as I said earlier, it's going to get more austere before it's over. But yes, they are moving in the right direction, albeit much more slowly than they should be.
So you think further and larger cuts should have been made than were decided upon?
Oh, absolutely. And
economics, history, and politics at Kingston University. Now, I first asked him if he's optimistic that the Troika and Greece can overcome their differences and reach a deal that's acceptable to both creditors and the new Greek government. Take a look at what he had to say.
I'm optimistic about the possibility of that being feasible. I'm not optimistic about the likelihood that the Troika is going to come to the party. I think the Greeks have been incredibly reasonable in what they've put forward, but the obstinacy on the EU side has me concerned that despite the fact that what the Greeks are suggesting is extremely sensible, that it may all fall apart in a heap.
Now, it's interesting. The German finance minister, Schäuble, acts like he has no plan B because he expects Greece to, either knuckle down or to be unimportant to the rest of Europe. And he said on Monday, quote, "I wouldn't know how financial markets will handle it without a program, but maybe he knows better." Now, this was obviously referring to Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis, and Schäuble went on to say, quote, "We've never forced anyone into a program. I'm ready for any kind of help, but if my help is not wanted, that's fine." Now, the lack of alarm is itself kind of alarming. So could this be Europe's Lehman moment?
It could be, but I mean, again, what's being suggested by Syriza is quite sensible. And Yanis has been thinking this out for about 6 years now. If you look at the detail of the proposal, it's always been about how do we manage to get the maximum improvement in our current situation without breaking existing EU rules and without needing any new institutions. So all it takes is for the Germans to look at it and say, yeah, that's quite sensible. That'd reduce that'd reduce the serviceable load on your debt from 10% to 1%, which is probably the most important proposal that Yanis has put forward about reclassifying debt that's within the Maastricht Treaty as being backed by the ECB but still paid for by each nation. It's extremely reasonable, and all it takes the Germans is the sense to say, yes, that's reasonable, we'll let you do it. Equally for the whole thing about going from having this ridiculous 4.5% surplus they're aiming for down to 1.5%, which is still not as far as I think it should go, but again, a very sensible change. So it's obstinacy on the German and the EU side that will cause this to fall apart, if it falls apart at all.
And what about what Varoufakis is proposing with GDP-linked bond payments? Is this sort of option-embedded debt restructuring basically the kind of thing that can align the interests of debtors and creditors? Yeah,
you know the old saying, if you owe the bank $100, you've got a problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, the bank's got a problem. This is the classic situation because, as Yanis has been saying for some time, Greece cannot pay back the debt they owe on the scale it's on without a dramatic change in the servicing arrangements of that debt. Now, if you actually push them to the brink, then they'll simply default, and that will cascade through the European financial system in a quite destructive way, because let's not forget, let's remember in the first place that these so-called Troika loans to Greece all go straight back to German and French banks to pay the debt servicing costs that have been built up on those debts. Virtually none of this money turns up in Greece, and of course they've been forced to spend far less of their own state-generated revenue on their own people. So the proposals are straightforward and sensible without actually abolishing any of the debt. And the one about linking it to growth, of course, if you have somebody who's failing, as you know, going down in output, and you insist they pay the debt, you're guaranteeing they'll go bankrupt and can't repay you at all. So at least if you say they're GDP linked, it means when they're booming, you get paid. When they're not, you have to take a delay in your payments, but you don't have them fall over completely, which is the alternative if you insist they pay in hell or high water.
Which, again, is good because it aligns interests, is what you're saying, essentially, and what Varoufakis is proposing. But, you know, now Greece claims that austerity, it's crushing their economy and has made it impossible for them to pay their debts. And like we've been discussing, and the Prime Minister recently said, quote, Greece wants to service its debt, which is now over 180% of GDP. It's impossible to service as long as our partners insist on austerity. So what do you make of this argument?
Well, the reason that the austerity is actually reducing the amount of money in Greece. This is what people don't get their heads around properly. Austerity sounds like saving money. What it's actually doing is destroying money, taking money out of the economy, and then saying, we want you to grow in physical terms, and oh, by the way, we want you to generate more money to pay the debt back. So it's insanely stupid policy, but it's part of the conventional wisdom of economics that ignores the very existence of money, let alone the role of debt in an economy. So we have to simply find a way to get from where the European Union is managing a fantasy model of the economy to the real world perspective that Yanis is bringing and that Syria is bringing, and of course the Greeks unfortunately are living.
British economist Charles Goodhart, he once quipped that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Now, people call that Goodhart's law now, and they use it to support anti-regulatory views. And I think it makes sense in talking about deficit targets because as soon as a deficit becomes a target, they cease to be a good measure. I mean, look at the initial IMF targets for Greece and how badly they missed. It's been a catastrophe. So, Steve, how can deficits be both the output measure showing how government is doing and a target at the same time?
Yeah, well, the whole problem is seeing deficits in the same way we see a household running a deficit, because a household running a deficit means it's spending more than it's getting back in and will have to declare bankruptcy ultimately. But a bank that is running a deficit is a bank that's creating more loans and it's getting back in repayments, is actually expanding. And exactly the same logic applies to the government. So to make it a target of the government running a surplus is to say to the government, we want you to take more money out of the economy each year than you put back into it, and we want you to make sure the economy grows at the same time. So it's not so much a case of Goodhart's law, it's a case of simply not understanding capitalism. And yet that's what the rules that the Greeks are being forced to try to follow are ones that don't understand capitalism at all. It's no wonder it's collapsing.
Now, let me piggyback off of that last question, Steve. I know this is a bit wonky, but maybe you can break this down for me. Here's the deal. Deficits are mostly endogenous, meaning that they rise automatically when unemployment does and fall automatically when unemployment does. So we've seen this in U.S. data, but what happens to private sector or trade sector balances when you target the deficit and try to make it a policy input as well as a final measure?
Well, this is where I want people to think visually here. If I can actually get your, maybe a graphics people can help me out here.
Yeah.
Just draw yourself a rectangle. And then cut it in two and call one half the government and the other half the private sector. And then say that you want the government to run a surplus. That's what you're targeting. That means you want the government sector part of the rectangle to take more money out of the private sector than it puts back in, which means there's a flow of money going from the private sector to the public sector. How can the private sector do that? You've got to then divide that little private sector half rectangle into another couple of rectangles, one of which is the private banks and the other the non-bank public. So for the private non-bank public to pay that money to the government, you have to have them borrowing from the private banks and increasing their indebtedness.
That was Steve Keen, head of the School of Economics, History and Politics at Kingston University. Time now for a quick break, but stick around because when we return, we're bringing you part 2 of my interview with Richard Werner, the man who coined the term quantitative easing, sat down with me to talk about just that. Then in today's Big Deal, Edward Harrison and I are discussing India, which growth rate is set to rival China's, and we'll look at what that means for the global marketplace coming up. And remember, you can see all segments